Hallelujah. Someone just handed me an article entitled, "It's Nice to Know Someone Cares." I haven't read it yet. It said that the funeral director was offering a drive-up window service. If you're reading the book, you already know that's rather mild to some of the things that go on. There's one that I don't think I'll offend you with by reading a commercial that they actually said was over the air, sung to the tune Rock of Ages. Should I read it or just forego that? I don't think I'll try to sing it, but you can get the idea with the tune Rock of Ages. Chambers caskets are just fine. See, chambers caskets are just fine. Made of sandalwood and pine. If your loved ones have to go, call Columbus 690. Are there no lengths to which they'll go? And then the second chorus, if your loved ones ever pass away, have them pass the Chambers way. Chambers customers all sing, "Death, O death, where is thy sting?" It's rather pathetic. But if you read the book, you'll find that, as I say, these things are not just points of humor, but actually there is much that is to be regretted in the contemporary American funeral, the practice of it. Now, we were looking at the bereavement process to get on the serious side. Well, that other was on the serious side. It's pathetic. The process of grief we gave you last time, which is generally called the normal process, I would call it the usual process that most people go through. The initial shock upon learning of the death of a loved one, the period of insensitivity, struggle with reality to accept the death, period of emotion and grief expressed, the transitional period when the person wants to begin to talk about it, selective memories, lastly, the acceptance of the loss. Now, there are three determinants which determine how people react in the grief process. Three things that determine it: the culture, the manner of death, and thirdly, the relationship to the deceased. There are three factors that determine how people will react, how the grief process will react, I should say. The grief process we gave you, most people go through that. Whether they're conscious of it or not, they do. There are three things that determine how they will go through this process, because no two people are alike. The general culture of which a person is a part. You see, people in different nations grieve differently. Now, that may sound strange to you, but you think about it a while. In fact, people with different educational backgrounds, different social status, people in different geographical regions right in this country grieve differently. Farm folk, that is, rural folk, have their own mores and attitudes and customs in connection with death and the funeral and grieving and all that. You wouldn't necessarily find in an urban situation. Our people in the city, of course, are different. And so grief is expressed differently by different social classes and so on. Even different races, the colored and the white people and the Orientals, they grieve differently. If you've ever been to a colored funeral and you've only been to a white funeral, you'll find there's a difference generally. And that doesn't make one any more anything than the other. We're just stating a fact. So the culture will determine how they will go through this process. And then secondly, the manner of death. You see, all of this is not only to give us an ethical understanding of terminal illness, death, and the funeral, but since death confronts all mankind, we are constantly having to deal with people who've lost loved ones. And when you know some of these facts and principles, you can help people more. For example, the manner of death. If you are trying to comfort someone who has lost a loved one, then you're ministering to them as a Christian. You don't minister to a family that's lost a 90-year-old mother the same way we would to a family that's lost a 9-month-old baby or a 9-year-old son. See what I mean? The manner of death determines whether or not it's a long or short illness. A long illness gives them a chance to adjust to the death before it happens. Now, I trust we don't have to keep repeating, for the benefit of those who have been sitting under the studies, the fact that we're not talking about how we at Faith Assembly would react necessarily. We're talking about the fact that we have to minister to families that are either in unbelief or non-charismatic or other charismatics many times who don't even have faith, and so we're dealing with this as a general thing. The manner of death definitely determines how people will react, or how the grief process will operate, and how you will be able best to help and minister to them with the Word and in the Spirit. For example, and I've been confronted with this in my ministry, a suicide. Now, in certain type deaths, there's a two-edged process of grief, a twofold process that doesn't operate in a normal death situation. A suicide, there are two types of grief expressed there. Not only are they grieving over the loss of a loved one, but the way he died, or she. They have all sorts of questions about where are they and what will happen, and I thought they were a Christian, or will God save a suicide, and so on. They are grieving in two ways. Or if a child dies, as against a 80-year-old grandmother or something. The manner of death, if they're killed, as against just some natural cause. Of course, nothing's natural, but to use current terminology, death isn't natural, it's very unnatural. Amen. Natural would be dying of old age or a common disease, I suppose. So the manner of death will determine how the process operates. And thirdly, the relationship. The depth and direction of the relationship determines how the grief process operates in individual cases and how you will minister toward others. The depth and direction of the relationship. We mean by that, how closely were they related to the deceased? And secondly, how close were they to the person? And there is a difference. How closely were they related? How close were they to the person? You'll run into cases where they were married to an individual and they weren't very close. So you don't minister to a surviving child who lost their parents in an accident if they were living away from home and didn't particularly get along with their parents, and there was no close relationship, the parents didn't care for them, and so on. You see what I mean? It isn't just the relationship. You might have experienced a greater loss of an uncle than a father because they were closer. Now, these are rather profound truths for you to contemplate because they have to do with the whole of humanity. And not everyone knows what's happening at the time of the most traumatic period of one's life. Now we come to the atypical and abnormal grief process. Now you will minister to and meet people that have abnormal reactions. You need to know how to recognize them and how to deal with them. We've been talking about what is normal, the normal process of grief and what will affect it. First, the atypical. It isn't so much abnormal, it just isn't typical, and that's called anticipatory grief, where they anticipate the grief. Anticipatory grief. See, this anticipatory grief occurs before the death takes place. They generally are able to work through the grief process that we gave you before they ever die, because in case of a long illness and terminal, when they know that it's certain but they don't know when, often the family works through the process. So you don't minister to people that have gotten over their weeping and concern before the person dies, the same way you do to a person that it's unexpected. Some people don't understand that. Well, I wonder why that family doesn't grieve for that loved one. I never saw them shed a tear, and people go around with their little tongues wagging. And so we're trying to help you realize that Jesus said, don't judge by outward appearance. I don't dare break down at a funeral myself, those I've conducted. I mean, we'd have a pretty sad time if I lost my composure at the graveside or somewhere. My wife said, sometimes I don't see how you hold up. Well, that's where you use your faith too. because you feel in your heart what the others are expressing outwardly. That's a part of the gift of ministry. Well, sometimes it would pay to weep with a person. That isn't what we're saying, but we're talking about that we can hold our composure for a time and for a reason. Maybe that's what they're doing at the funeral themselves, not wanting to give any wrong impression that they're going all to pieces because they're Christian and they know where the loved one is because that person who died was a Christian. Or to say, in this particular case, the atypical type grief process, they've already worked through it because they've had plenty of time to do that. It's in the case of a long or terminal illness where it was expected. Now, we want to deal next especially with the abnormal grief reactions. I've met people with abnormal reactions. You will, and you have to know how to recognize it so you can help them. Because if they stay too long in the abnormal period or too long in the grief process, they can open the door to spirits of suicide, depression, wanting to go be with the other one and all of that. So there's an abnormal grief reaction that we should recognize. And there are several kinds. One is the delayed grief reaction, where it's delayed for a considerable period. And there's several causes for this. Sometimes you'll be in situations, now some of you have already gone through some of these things and you'll now be able to put together and understand what you've experienced by us explaining it to you, but there are several causes for this. Sometimes it's because of the responsibility that falls on one person at the time of the passing of a loved one. When the rest of the family has lost their composure, they've broken down, and somebody has to take care of the arrangements and keep things stabilized so that person, because of responsibility, withholds the expression of his or her grief. He knows to shed a tear, that he won't control himself or herself, then no one will be able to get through the whole business. So that person, because of responsibility, sometimes maintains his composure, but then he keeps on maintaining it and becomes abnormal. He or she never goes through the normal expression of grief. We've already explained what we mean by grief. It's quite normal to express grief because Jesus wept at the tomb of Lazarus. The scriptures say, weep with those who weep, laugh with those who laugh. So that's quite normal. Shortest verse in the Bible, Jesus wept. I think that's significant. That's one of the causes, responsibility falling on one. Another is fear that to show grief would be expression of a lack of faith, lack of Christian faith. And people don't realize, as we've just said, that it's normal to express a certain amount of sorrow. Not sorrowing as those who have no hope, but it's not abnormal to express emotion. But some think that it would be a lack of Christian belief in the resurrection and where the person is in their faith. Sometimes others don't express it. This pertains especially to men because it isn't masculine to weep. And if you look at a funeral service, you'll find out that it's generally the lady shedding the tears. Generally. If you had 20 people there and 10 were weeping, 9 of them probably be the women. It's not masculine, some think. And some carry that to extreme, so they never express their grief at their wife or child's funeral. That's what we're saying. It becomes abnormal. Then it's not acceptable for certain classes to show too much emotion in public, especially the upper classes, that is, the well-to-do. We're well-to-do, but in the sense of social status and so forth. You can go to your funerals where the wealthy, the rich, and the socially elite have passed away, and you may not see a tear at all. It's just beneath their dignity to weep. Now, that isn't true in all cases. We're telling you what the sociological facts are, generally. Now, the result of the delayed grief process, whatever the cause, is that in a year or two, the person becomes a depressive. Generally, often at least, the person becomes a depressive. It shows up, but it shows up sometime later in an abnormal situation. Then another abnormal grief reaction is the prolonged grief reaction. Sometimes it's prolonged. That's very abnormal. We said 3 to 6 months is normal. Of course, you can't put a time on that, but after many, many thousands of years, it's been determined that 3 to 6 months is what most human beings expect is normal for grieving for the loss of someone that was dear to you. But the prolonged grief process, the person has a block here between 3 and 4 of the 8 steps we gave you. They never get beyond 3 and 4. And that is facing the reality of the death and the expression of emotion. And that happens so often that books are written on it, these stages and processes. Of course, most who write books don't know how to deal with it. We recognize it as opening the door to alien spirits who cause people all sorts of trouble. But prolonged grief, the person so categorized as a person who has a block at the point of facing reality, the reality of the death and the grief process. That is what we said last time, the flood of emotion that comes after the funeral generally. Another abnormal type of grief expressed sometimes is what's called the distorted grief reaction. Distorted grief reaction. This is the person who doesn't accept the death. But in this case, rather than just blocking out, see that the one we just gave you, prolonged grief reaction, they never get beyond a certain point. This isn't the same thing. This is distorted. The person doesn't want to accept the reality of death, and so they do things to keep the memory alive. They know the person's gone. See, they didn't get a block there, but they're trying to, in an abnormal way, prolong the memory. You see this in pilgrimages to cemeteries. Now, I mean pilgrimages. We're not trying to hurt anyone's sensitivity at this point. Now, this isn't the abnormal state we're talking about, but a person that feels like every armistice day, or at least once or maybe twice a year, they have to go to the graveside, don't have a Christian view of death because the person isn't there. In fact, the body isn't there after a few years. And you're just going to a piece of stone with a name on it. Now, at this stage, we're not trying to say to hurt sensitivities, because if you're working through the American way of death, you ought to be able to stomach a few things we say, but now. This, like church discipline, is not necessarily the most pleasant subject, but since death comes to all men, Romans 5:12, then we better know something about it. I can help people because inwardly I don't memorize steps. That isn't what I'm saying. Don't memorize those 8 steps. But be aware of what takes place by having heard them and studying about them, and then when you're confronted with a situation, you're able to help people. But here, a pilgrimage to the cemetery, where it's a pilgrimage, the person is there to them, and they go to the graveside and talk to the deceased. Or mother worship. We have a lot, especially in America, of male attachment to mother in an abnormal way. We've been through that already back in other areas of Christian ethics. But cases where you'll see the son have a lighted picture, portrait of the mother in some special place in the house. Keeps it lighted, and he talks to mother when no one's around. They recognize that isn't mother, and mother's gone and all that, but it's mother worship. And so they go through the rest of their life keeping this memory alive in an abnormal way. That's what we're saying. It's a distorted grief reaction. Now, many times, this results also in trying to contact the dead through seances. When it's a distorted grief reaction, they are candidates for a seance, and many of them end up in seances. Thousands do. Not a few hundred, thousands upon thousands do. Those are the major abnormal types of grief reaction. Now, let me give you several symptoms so you can recognize it. It's like in occult deliverance. Oh, I don't know how many. I guess hundreds and hundreds of people I've talked to. I've ministered to I don't know how many. But as I talk to them, I don't have to talk to them over 2 or 3 minutes. And right away, I'm detecting certain things that say to me they need occult deliverance. Well, so with this, if you know some symptoms as you talk to people, you're saying inwardly, this person needs counseling and prayer and help. They've come to you. Or whether or not they have, you know they need help. And you're able to recognize there's something wrong here. And as you talk to them, you might say, have you lost a loved one recently in the past year or two? And a lot of times they say, yes. And things they're saying to you, they show there's an abnormal grief reaction. And then you can help them at that point. You see, God gave us minds. We don't minister with the mind, but He gave us minds to be able to discern things. This is just a part of the spiritual education process. All right, here's some symptoms of distortion. Overactivity. Overactivity. Now, there isn't anything wrong with getting busy after a loved one's passed away. That's sometimes healthy. But overactivity, to where they just burn themselves out in activity so they won't have to think about the loss of the loved one. These things happen so often that you need to know about them. Another symptom of distortion in the grief process is sometimes the individual actually takes on the symptoms that the loved one died with. And of course, this is a spirit they open themselves to. And the wife dies of diabetes, and the husband starts having those symptoms. Imagines he has them. Or the husband dies of a coronary, and she gets heart palpitation or whatever. They actually become ill. If you're dealing with a person who said, I don't know why I'm suffering this particular condition, and by the way, my wife died of it a year ago. You see, now you can start putting 2 and 2 together. Well, something abnormal here. And then the other things we've taught you about deliverance and so forth, you know how to deal with it. Another is the change in attitude toward relatives. A marked change toward the relatives. Where they did get along, now suddenly there's a big court squabble over disposal of property and the children, where they're going to live and whatever. Change in attitude. Now that's abnormal. May be normal for the world, but it's abnormal anyway in reaction to grief. And another kind of goes along with that, but it's not the same as hostility. Hostility. And here it's hostility toward a specific person after the loss of a loved one. Then the survivor begins to manifest an extremely hostile attitude toward the doctor who tended him at his death, or the pastor of the church that conducted the funeral. Or in-laws may suddenly develop a hostility toward the surviving husband or wife. This happens not infrequently. Hostility. Another abnormal symptom is withdrawal from society. Person just sits around, shades drawn, morbid thoughts, weeps, can't get back into circulation, drops out of all social contact with other people or other Christians or whatever. And you know something's wrong. Now, through that 3 to 6 months period, that wouldn't be abnormal. We're talking about what, is a long-term situation. Another is dispossession. Dispossession, another abnormal symptom. Dispossession, where the survivor tries to dispose of all property. Sells the home, car, gives everything away that he can, and he's trying to join the loved one, but he doesn't want to commit suicide, so he punishes himself or herself this way. They give away everything so that they're really dead while they live, is the attitude. It's a spirit, of course. Now, these things happen often enough that it's recognizable. Then addictions, symptoms of distortion of grief would be addictions after the death. They get addicted to alcohol or drugs. That happens not infrequently. People discover the survivor is an alcoholic, or they've got dilated pupils every time they see them, and it isn't contact lenses. Sometimes I don't know which. I wonder sometimes people trying to kid you that they're walking out an eye situation with faith, and when I eyeball them, they're either, well, I wouldn't say they're on drugs, but their contacts are showing. We'll just give you that for free. So in other words, you're not fooling Hobart with your contacts if you're trying to convince somebody that, well, I'm just walking everything out by faith and I got no problems. Praise the Lord. I don't know why I threw that in. Another abnormal symptom is deep depression. No joy in life, no joy in the Lord. Christians, and they've lost all their joy. Deep depression. Then one we've already mentioned, calling up the dead at a seance. Well, you could write a book on that we just gave you. Why didn't somebody do it? I don't know. Now we're dealing with the third aspect of the Christian's attitude toward terminal illness, death, and the funeral. We're looking at the funeral, of course, and this is the grief process. Now, the assignment is the book American Way of Death. We could take a long time trying to say what's in the book. So what I give you, I trust, will be just highlights of concepts and principles and things that are necessary to know, but the book itself will be self-explanatory about how the Americans are ridiculed and looked down upon at this point by the rest of the world, most of the rest of the world. Because the practices as you know them at the funeral are not only unscriptural, but they're pagan, and the worship of the body, and that isn't the person. Let me give you 3 ethical problems in connection with the funeral and their cause. 3 important ethical problems in connection with the American funeral that we're confronted with. As we said last time, when you're dealing with people at this time, it isn't the time to educate them. You have to do that before. And most people just, even though they don't appreciate having to spend thousands of dollars on a funeral, yet many, many people, if not most, don't have too much sales resistance at that time. Americans do have a way of having a display room even for their caskets, where they can sell you one, which the English, by the way, laugh at. Why put the remains of a person in a $5,000 bronze casket and then put that in a concrete vault? What are you preserving? As they point out, all you're preserving in the concrete vault is the casket, because you can't preserve the body. They only put enough preserves in to last through the funeral. If they were going to preserve the body, they could do it if they'd learned the Egyptian way, but it would be like leather, you know, the mummies. So their purpose isn't to preserve, they're just kidding you to get your money. Formaldehyde and all is to get you through the funeral, because it lasts generally 3 days. As we'll see a little later, and you'll see in the book, there's absolutely no law in any land that requires embalming. That's just the invention of the funeral director to make money. But here are 3 problems in connection with the whole American concept, and that's the problem of cultural conventionality. Talking about custom and what's conventional. The problem of cultural conventionality. And what we mean here is that we are required, because of custom or conventionality, to act in a certain way. We don't let, in this nation at least, the person be himself at the passing of a loved one. We expect them to act a certain way, and he'll get criticized if he doesn't. And the people go along with acting a certain way sometimes when they don't even feel it. So they'll dab a handkerchief to an eye when there's no tear there because, well, that's expected. Maybe he's already shed all the tears he can shed for the time being, or whatever. But anyway, the problem of cultural conventionality in America, we expect people to act a certain way. By that we mean we expect them to dress in a certain way. Of course, some of that is not true in urban areas as it would be in a rural area where they would expect you to wear black. I've got a blue pinstripe suit with a vest and a dark blue shirt and a nice dark blue tie. And I really like it. I've only worn it once, but I like it. I wore it once here, and I could hear people talking about it way up here. Now, I could wear that at a funeral. What's wrong with it? I wouldn't do it but once, and you'd find out what's wrong with it. So we expect them to dress a certain way. We expect them, secondly, to react a certain way. We expect them to go through a certain routine for a certain length of time. The problem of cultural conventionality. We expect them to express their emotions in a certain way, to cry or not to cry. Some situations we've said crying is evidence of a lack of faith as a Christian. In others, not crying is a lack of concern. Why can't we let people express their grief the way they want? Well, that would be nice, wouldn't it? It's somehow, this has gotten into my spirit because if I'm dealing with a person who's just lost a wife, I've had to deal with situations, or a husband, and they're not weeping. That has never bothered me. Because I believe in letting that person express when and where they want to, whatever they want. In fact, maybe that's why some get abnormal, because they're going through something that's artificial because of custom and conventionality. So you see the problem. Another problem is that of the unrealistic and unscriptural concepts of death in America. The problem of the unrealistic and unscriptural concepts of death that we have in America. Here in this country, and believe me, if you read the book, you'll find it's only in this country. Few exceptions in other countries. But in this country, we try to mask the reality of death through embalming and cosmetics. Now, we already dealt with that, so we don't have to say any more about it. We try to mask the reality of death with the embalming process and cosmetics. The flowers and the satin-lined caskets, they look like they're in eternal repose. They're not dead, they're just asleep. It's all right to talk about a person being asleep in Jesus or departed if those aren't the only terms you use. You see, but those are exclusive terms, which is another thing we want to say, the new vocabulary that's been developed in America. We're still under the same problem of unrealistic, unscriptural concepts about death. One is attempt to mask its reality, another is the new vocabulary, which attempts to mask its reality. The service is no longer a funeral, it's a service of memory. The person isn't dead, he's departed. He's deceased. He's over there. He's gone on to his reward. And all of that. He isn't dead. The change in vocabulary. The coffin is now a casket. The hearse is now a coach. Flowers are floral tributes. The body is the deceased or the loved one. The undertaker is now a funeral director. Are you aware that just in the past, just recently, say in the last 50 years, has the funeral director taken on a distinguished position in the eyes of Americans? He was the butt of morbid jokes. His occupation, he's an undertaker. He takes people under, was looked down upon. But now he's a funeral director. He's not an undertaker. That is rather a dignified sounding designation. That's like now they're no longer janitors, they're custodians, and garbage collectors are sanitary engineers. Well, all in the same category, I guess. And then still under this heading of this problem of unrealistic, unscriptural concepts of death in America is, thirdly, a display of the dead is supposed to give grief therapy. We'll say more about that later, but these are certain things under this heading, that the reason they say they display the corpse is it has a certain amount of grief therapy. It helps a person have a lasting memory picture of the loved one in beautiful repose. We'll say more about that later if it's valid. And you get a lot of argument. Funeral directors run ads in papers and publish pamphlets and all. That's one of their big arguments, the grief therapy. The value of the psychology at that time cannot be underestimated. The final lasting memory picture. And you actually get people now taking pictures of the corpse. It boggles your mind, but I know a Baptist church where he did it of his father. He was just all over the place shooting flash shots. I thought that was an abnormal grief process or reaction. Wow. Can you imagine inviting your friends over to see your slides? Right in the middle of Becky and Jimmy at the beach playing in the sand, flashes on the screen. What's that? That's Mother. These are some of the results of the unscriptural, unnatural attitude in America toward death. You don't find this in other nations, even in the heathen nations, for the most part. Now, thirdly, the problem, we're talking about problems in connection with the funeral, problem of commercialism and exhibitionism. These are three major problems with respect to the American funeral: exhibitionism, commercialism. Now, I don't have to tell you, modern day funerals, most of the time, are quite lavish. Lavish. There are three results for them being so lavish. One is the commercial-minded, profit-seeking undertakers, or funeral directors, if you wish, who have sold the American public on the lasting image. It's a type of therapy to have a big, lavish funeral. So the commercial-minded undertaker is the cause for the modern-day lavish funeral in America. Another reason is the desire for social approval. You have to do what the Joneses do, even at death. Desire for social approval. You have a lavish display and everyone approves. Not everyone, but most everyone. Then sometimes the lavish display is because of guilt feelings by the survivor toward the deceased. They feel they didn't express the love and concern for them as they would like to have or should have when they were alive, and so because of guilt feelings, they spend a normal amount of money on putting them in the ground. Tremendous amount of money are spent sometimes at funerals and going up every day. And sometimes it's because it's a cover-up for a lack of grief, genuine grief. They spend a lot of money at the funeral because really there is no grief, and this covers that up because everyone thinks they're so concerned. Now, in the book, The American Way of Death, I draw your attention to chapter 13. If you make a note to pay some particular attention to chapter 13, where the author deals with the origin and development of the current funeral practices in America. The author shows that there's no resemblance between the funeral practices today than those of even 50 years ago. No resemblance whatever. and that the lavishness and the display of the dead and the metal caskets and the burial vaults and the banks of store-bought flowers and the ubiquitous offices of the funeral director, she says, are all of recent vintage in this country, and each has been methodically designed and tailored to exact the maximum profit for the trade. Chapter 13, you want to read it. She says, nor can the responsibility for the 20th century American funeral be laid to the door of the Judeo-Christian beliefs, because, as she points out, neither the Jews nor the Christian Bible, nor Christians up until 50 years ago, would have anything to do with the modern-day funeral. This is all of recent vintage. I believe she's the one that cites in that chapter that the Roman Catholic Church does not require embalming or beautification, and endorses her book. The Jewish faith does not require embalming and thinks display is an abomination, and they bury the body in a shroud in a simple and quick manner. Chapter 13, make a note to read it. Early Christians regarded embalming a pagan custom. The practice, I'm still quoting that chapter, the practice of preserving dead bodies with chemicals, decorating them with paint and powder, and arranging them for public showing originated with the pagan Egyptians. Anybody ought to know that. The practice declined until revived by American undertakers last century during the Civil War. You want to know who started it all? Last century, Dr. Thomas Holmes is called the father of American embalming. He popularized the idea during the Civil War by embalming 4,000 Civil War dead at $100 per corpse. He became rich thereby. $100 times 4,000, figure it out. You could retire today on that, and back during Civil War days, that was an immense fortune. He got the idea. Why not do as the Egyptians did? All these soldiers getting killed on the field, and they bury them, where they're killed. Why, if I can preserve their bodies and ship them home, how their parents would love to see them. That's the idea. And it caught on like wildfire. Johnny came marching home, but not in the way they expected. The use of the coffin was not popular in Western cultures until 200 years ago. What do you need with a coffin? Stop, think about it. In many parts of the world today, they never bury in a coffin. What's the coffin doing? What's it for? It can't preserve the body. If you're outside America, you're not going to display it. And so even the use of it in this country is relatively new. Well, these practices used to be opposed by the church, but now they're a part of the training of all things in the seminary and practiced by pastors. I said to one pastor, this was long ago when I was still in my studies, and I had been a pastor during college and so forth, but I was still in my studies, and I said, I'm going to recommend in the future that any time that I conduct a funeral, that we do it at the funeral home, because that's where the people, turn to first of all anyway. I said, why bring the dead into the place that we testify there's life? And he said, well, I don't know a better place to have a funeral than in a church. We at least have gotten away from, as Baptists and Methodists and others used to do, and you can still see them around, burying the dead in the front yard of the church. You can still see them around. But you could always tell a Baptist or Methodist church you'd look for a graveyard if you want to find a church. That's so morbid. Can you imagine walking in to the glory barn if we just had tombstones surrounding it? And many churches, the tombstones literally surround the building. You can find one right on 15. That the church is built in the midst of the dead. And of course you can draw your own conclusions. That is a fact. Embalming was reserved for the rich, the powerful, the royalty. Embalming of kings and the rich and the great did take place in Rome and Europe, but not the common person. The royalty, the great, sometimes were preserved because the pagan heart wanted to try to preserve the great person. Alexander the Great was preserved with wax and honey. Ship his body back to Greece. Charlemagne was embalmed. I don't know what they used. Lord Nelson was returned to England. He died, at sea? He returned to England in a barrel of brandy. That'll preserve. That'll preserve him. Yes, that'll preserve him. Wow. But a lot of royal persons forbade them to mutilate their body and didn't want embalming. Sometimes they did anyway. FDR didn't want to be embalmed and displayed, but they did it anyway. They said, well, we didn't find his will where he said that until after he lay in state for a long time. Well, maybe they didn't find it till after, but anyway, it wasn't his wish. Funerals in England. I got this somewhere. Listen to it. They dislike fancy, expensive coffins. We have some friends, by the way, who are from London. And we weren't discussing the question of death in this way, but I do recall one time they said it took us years to get used to the American way of the funeral. That we were horrified to see corpses painted and perfumed staring back at us in a funeral home. They couldn't believe it. So this is a point of view firsthand that we got from them, but here is something from the English practice. Funerals in England, they dislike fancy, expensive coffins. They dress them in simple shrouds, like pajamas or a nightdress, because they're not going to be displayed. And why put a $200 suit on a person to bury him? Very few are embalmed, very few. And then they don't call it embalming because they say that suggests ancient Egyptian culture. They call it temporary preservation, sanitary treatment. But very few are embalmed. Then it would be for some peculiar reason. The open casket funeral is entirely unknown in England. In most other parts of the world. Cost of the average funeral, $140. You can get some for $40. Years ago, we worked through this as a church when the Lord got us out of the denominational system. It's not like this is the first time I've taught this. Taught it in seminary, I've taught it to our church. And we decided if we were going to be a New Testament church, we should practice what we preach. So I went to some local funeral directors, and just like the book says, you can find funeral directors who will bury you cheaply. I made arrangements. That's back in those days. I don't have to make arrangements like that as I got the Holy Ghost, because I'm confessing that I'll be here when Jesus comes. Now, I've got a lot of scripture for that, so don't boggle your mind on that if you have never heard me say it before. I've got a lot of reasons to believe that this is the last generation. But anyway, if you're going to confess you're going to die, then why put a burden on your family? So that was our idea back then. That's way back in the 60s, early 60s. So I went to a local director. Why, he said, no, there's no law that you have to embalm. I can conduct the type funeral you want for I think it was $160. Of course, you have to buy the hole in the ground, but that's additional. $160. That's back in the 60s. It wouldn't be a whole lot more than that now. Well, why should it cost a fortune to bury a body when, before they invented laws against it, everybody was rural. Most people lived in rural areas. You simply had a plot on the back of your farm or somewhere. You didn't have funeral homes. The dead were washed, the body was washed, put in clean clothing, pajamas or whatever, night shirts, whatever they had, and reverently put in the ground where they should be. They weren't sit around stared at. And I recognize that what we say is an oversimplification, because you've got people that had wakes and they would sit up and watch the body for a night or two and that sort of thing. But generally speaking, it didn't cost anything to bury a dead person. Why should it? England, we're saying. Cost of funerals about $140, and some for $40. Usually only the immediate relatives and close friends, 6 or 8 people. And here, the body's put on display for the public to come in and gaze if they want. That's the morbid part to me, to display the deceased to the gaze of the world. That's an abomination to God and to common sense to me. I don't know why people are so gullible. Beautification of the body is taboo. No cosmetics whatever. No embalming. The whole mentality of burying people in England is the dead should be disposed of as respectable and quietly as possible, and quickly as possible. Embalming. This was taken out of another book on the subject. No law requires embalming. No religious doctrine commands it, nor is it dictated by considerations of health or sanitation. No law requires embalming. If you didn't get a hold of a book like The American Way of Death, I'll warrant you that you heard that for the first time in this church. No law requires it. Don't you let them rope you into a $10,000, $5,000 funeral or whatever. There's no law that requires that you buy a vault, and yet they'll sell most people a vault, a concrete vault that doesn't preserve anything but the casket. I don't want to get morbid, but it's common knowledge that you don't preserve the body in a bronze casket in a concrete vault. All you preserve is a bronze casket. So say we don't want to get morbid, the book will handle that, but you'd be surprised. One thing you don't want is a bronze casket. You better let dust return to dust, because there's some pretty gruesome things that happen when they don't. Well, I don't suppose I'll tell you about some of those, because you read it for yourself. In no part of the world but in Northern America is embalming widely used. The purpose of embalming is to make the corpse presentable for viewing in a suitable, costly container. This is from a funeral magazine, the rationale of public display of the body. A funeral service is a social function at which the deceased is the guest of honor and the center of attraction. Quoted from a funeral magazine. What about the argument used by funeral directors that the elaborate display of the dead, cosmetically made up, is a form of grief therapy for the survivor? Funeral directors state that the mental and emotional comfort given survivors who review restored lifelike remains gives them a final memory picture and has an emotional and psychological value. The mental and emotional comfort given survivors who review the lifelike remains, and you can put lifelike in quotes, lifelike corpse. That's a contradiction in terms. As I've shared with you before, I've been in cases where you go to pay your respects sometimes. I never look anymore. That's the most morbid sight I've ever. I never look at an open casket anymore, but people will say, you can hear them, doesn't he or she look natural? You just would like to walk up to them and say, no, they're the most unnatural looking specimen of a human being I've ever seen. They look like a wax mummy to me. You want to say it, but you can't say it. A sociologist at Stanford University who, dealing with grief therapy, says that the argument that the display of the corpse gives grief therapy is not valid. He asks the question, why should be so many modern Americans have more trouble, are more incapable of managing their loss and their grief than people of other cultures? As a sociologist, he wants to know, why is it that we have to resort to specialists at the time of death? Everyone from the doctor who takes them out in terminal illness into a state of limbo to where they don't even know when they die, to the funeral director who covers the grave site with green artificial grass so you can't see the hole. See, everything is masking death. So he says, why is it Americans need these specialists to minister to them? Why is it that we can't handle our grief like other cultures? Well, we're telling you why. It's because we've been brainwashed now by the churches as well as the world and the trade out there, funeral trade. He said that the modern method of viewing the restored remains actually delays the normal bereavement process. And you can see why it would. See, the funeral director argues it gives grief therapy. They have a final memory picture of a beautiful-looking corpse. He says that delays the normal grief process because you're masking the reality of death. And it keeps it from happening as it should. Because all you can remember is something looking like it was asleep in eternal repose. Not dead, just resting, asleep. Might any day sit up or something. It's morbid. Well, praise the Lord for a Christian scriptural view of all this so we can keep a balance. Right here at this point, you see, you're going to be another weirdo. You're going to be criticized. Oh, look what they're teaching up there now. Well, I got away with this in the seminary. I guess I can get away with it in the church. Huh? Praise God.